Pongo, Part 1. James Walker pulled up to the curb of their new duplex, letting out a slow exhale. The move to the town of Ridgewood had taken longer than expected, and the sun was already starting to dip below the horizon. This was supposed to feel like a relief after all the months of planning, job interviews, and securing the offer that had brought them here. Instead, it felt strange, like stepping into a new life that didn't quite fit yet. He glanced over at Sarah, who was in the passenger seat. Scrolling through her phone while their three boys in the back seat, Donovan, Elliot, and Lucas, peered out at the unfamiliar surroundings. "This is it," James said, forcing a smile. "Our new home?" Sarah glanced up briefly from her phone, already familiar with the view. "At least the inside is nicer than the outside," she murmured, trying to reassure herself as much as the kids. They'd done a walkthrough with the landlord a few weeks earlier, so they knew what to expect. Donovan, the oldest at 14, stared out the window and smirked. "Looks like one of those houses from the scary movies. You know, the kind where people disappear." Elliot, 10 years old, frowned at his brother. "Don't say that, Donnie." James shot Donovan a look through the rearview mirror. "Hey, knock it off. It's a nice place. You'll get used to it." "Does it have Wi-Fi?" Donovan asked, his smirk still firmly in place. Before James could respond, Sarah opened her door and stepped out, taking a better look at their new surroundings. "Well, it's not forever," she said, her voice half reassuring, half resigned, "just until we get settled in." James followed her lead, getting out of the car and heading to the trunk to start unloading the luggage. As he did, he noticed movement across the street. A couple was walking over. He recognized the man immediately. It was Nathan, their landlord, whom he had already met during the earlier walkthrough. But the woman beside him, shorter and full of energy, was someone James hadn't met before. "Hi there," the woman called out as they crossed the street, her voice bright and welcoming. "You must be the Walkers. I'm Kayla, Nathan's wife." James waved, doing his best to appear friendly, though he was exhausted from the move. "Yeah, that's us. Good to finally meet you, Kayla. I'm James. This is my wife, Sarah. And these are our boys." Kayla's eyes lit up when she saw the boys climbing out of the car, full of curiosity. "3 boys? Oh, that must keep you busy. We don't have kids ourselves yet, but I've always thought it would be fun." Nathan, who had been walking quietly beside her, gave James a brief nod of recognition. His demeanor was as it had been during the walkthrough, friendly enough, but with an edge of seriousness that suggested he preferred to keep things professional. "Good to see you again, James," Nathan said with a firm handshake. "Glad to see you and the family made it here safely." "Thanks," James replied, shaking his hand. It's been a long day, but we're here." Kayla crouched down slightly, addressing the boys. "And you must be Donovan, Elliot, and Lucas, right? I'm sure you'll love it here. It's such a quiet neighborhood, perfect for families." Donovan, still skeptical, muttered under his breath, "Too quiet." James gave him a sharp look before turning back to Kayla. "Yeah, the boys are excited," he said, though Donovan's sarcasm didn't go unnoticed. Just then, Charlie, the small Jack-Russell mix, started barking excitedly from the back of the car. James popped the trunk, and the little dog shot out like a rocket, darting around the yard, sniffing everything. "Oh, my goodness, he's adorable," Kayla exclaimed, crouching down to greet Charlie, who wagged his tail furiously and licked her hand. Nathan raised an eyebrow, but his expression remained as neutral as ever. "Small dog," he commented. "Shouldn't cause any problems." James smiled, hoping to keep things light. "Yeah, Charlie's a good dog, full of energy, but he's great with kids." Kayla stood up, brushing some dog hair off her jeans. "Well, we're getting a dog of our own in 3 weeks. His name is Pongo. He's a rescue, a mixed breed like your Charlie. We're so excited. It'll be our first dog." "A dog, huh?" Sarah said, smiling politely. "That's great. Maybe Charlie and Pongo will get along." "Oh, they'll be best buds, I'm sure," Kayla beamed. Maybe we can even set up a playdate once Pongo's settled in. James returned her smile, though the idea of a doggy playdate wasn't exactly high on his list of priorities. Yeah, maybe, he said noncommittally. Nathan's gaze shifted back to the house, and for a moment James wondered if he was silently judging how quickly, or slowly, they were settling in. Well, Kayla said, sensing the need to wrap up the conversation, we won't keep you from unpacking. But if you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. We're just across the street. Thanks, Sarah said with a polite wave. We'll definitely let you know if we need anything. Nathan and Kayla turned and walked back across the street, but Kayla glanced over her shoulder one last time, still smiling. This neighborhood is perfect for families, you'll see. As they disappeared back into their duplex, James exhaled, feeling some of the tension ease from his shoulders. He turned to Sarah, who was already directing the boys to grab their things from the car. They seem nice enough, James said, chuckling lightly. Sarah nodded, but looked thoughtful. Yeah, nice, but Nathan's a little intense, don't you think? And Kayla, well, she's a lot. James shrugged. Nathan's just a typical landlord, probably just making sure we're decent tenants. As for Kayla, she seems harmless. Just excited about their dog, I guess. Maybe, Sarah said, glancing across the street one more time before turning her attention back to the house. Well, let's get this over with. I want to get the boys settled before it gets too late. The rest of the evening passed in a flurry of unpacking and trying to wrangle the kids into some sort of routine. Donovan had staked his claim on the upstairs room with the best view, while Elliot and Lucas were sharing a room down the hall. Charlie darted back and forth, sniffing at every corner of their new home. James stood in the kitchen, sipping from a cold glass of water, staring out the back window. The yard was small but fenced in, perfect for Charlie to run around. As if on cue, Charlie raced out the back door, barking at a bird that had briefly landed on the fence. James smiled to himself, but there was still that nagging feeling at the back of his mind. Maybe it was the stress of the move, or maybe it was just the unfamiliarity of a new place. Atati. Hey, don't forget to feed Charlie, Sarah called from the living room where she was helping Lucas set up a board game. I got it, James replied, reaching into a box marked Kitchen for the dog food. He poured some into Charlie's bowl and set it down by the sliding glass door, watching as the dog eagerly chowed down. Out of the corner of his eye, James glanced across the street, where Kayla and Nathan's house was softly illuminated by their porch light. He could see Kayla moving around inside, perhaps tidying up after dinner. Nathan wasn't in sight, though. The neighborhood was quiet, just like Kayla had promised, maybe too quiet. James shook his head, trying to shrug off the unease. They had just moved in. Everything would start to feel normal soon, right? At least that's what he hoped. 3 weeks passed quickly, and by then the Walker family had settled into their new home. The days felt long and uneventful, the neighborhood as quiet as Kayla had promised. Still, James couldn't shake the subtle, creeping sense that something was off. It was nothing he could put his finger on, just a vague feeling that lingered in the back of his mind. One evening, Sarah came into the room with a raised eyebrow. You hear about Pongo? James looked up from his laptop. What about him? Kayla texted me. They picked him up this afternoon. He's home now. James leaned back in his chair. Well, there he is. Sarah shrugged. I guess we should expect that doggy playdate she kept talking about. James laughed lightly. Yeah, I figured she wouldn't let that go. But that night, when James peeked out the window, Pongo didn't seem like the ordinary dog Kayla had been so excited about. The dog stood in Nathan and Kayla's yard, his dark shape barely visible in the dim glow of the porch light. He was much larger than James had expected, tall and lanky with unkempt fur that seemed to bristle even when there was no wind. Pongo's movements were strange, too deliberate, as if he were constantly aware of every shift in his body. His head snapped toward James's window, and for a moment, James swore the dog was staring directly at him. A chill ran down his spine. After a long moment, Pongo turned and trotted back to the porch, where he curled up but kept his eyes open, watching the street. James shook his head, trying to shrug off the unease. It was just a dog, a rescue dog, no less. He was probably still getting used to his surroundings. But something about Pongo's gaze stuck with him. The next evening, James and Donovan went out for the usual bike ride around the neighborhood. The sun was setting, and the sound of distant highway traffic hummed faintly in the background. As they pedaled through the quiet streets, Donovan suddenly slowed down, pointing toward the far end of the block. "Dad, look." James followed his son's gaze. Standing just outside Nathan and Kayla's yard was Pongo, watching them. The dog's posture was stiff, his head tilted slightly as though he were listening to something. James frowned. He's probably just curious. Donovan stopped his bike entirely, staring at Pongo. There's something weird about him. James glanced at his son. "Donnie, he's just a dog. He's probably still getting used to the neighborhood, that's all." Donovan shook his head. "No, it's not that. It's the way he's standing. Like he's waiting for something." Before James could respond, Donovan's face went pale, and he turned to his dad, wide-eyed. "Did you hear that?" James furrowed his brow. "Hear what?" Donovan's voice dropped to a whisper. "He's talking." James blinked. "Talking? You mean barking?" Donovan shook his head, his face serious. "No, I swear I heard him. He said something." James listened, but all he could hear was the steady hum of the highway in the distance. "You're just hearing the noise from the highway, buddy. Sound carries weird around here." But Donovan wasn't convinced. "Dad, I heard him. It wasn't just noise, it was like whispering. From the dog." James sighed, trying to keep his voice steady. "Look, I'm sure it was just the wind or something. Pongo's not talking." Just as James said that, Pongo's ears perked up, and his head turned sharply toward them. The dog stared for a long moment, his eyes gleaming in the fading light. Without warning, Pongo took a step forward, his gaze still locked on them. Then, just as suddenly, he leapt over the fence and disappeared into Nathan and Kayla's yard, as if nothing had happened. James felt his chest tighten. "Come on, let's head back." That night, James sat on the couch, the TV on in the background while Sarah folded laundry next to him. The boys had gone to bed, but Donovan's words from earlier echoed in his mind. He's talking. It wasn't the first time Donovan had let his imagination get the better of him, but this felt different. James glanced out the window, his eyes immediately landing on Pongo, who was sitting in Nathan and Kayla's yard. The dog was still, staring into the street, his head slightly cocked as though listening for something. James shook his head, trying to push the thought away, but his unease grew. "James?" Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. "You okay?" "Huh?" James blinked, turning back to her. "You've been staring out that window for like 10 minutes, Sarah said with a small smile. "What's up?" James hesitated, then sighed. "It's Pongo. Donovan swears he heard him talking." Sarah laughed lightly, shaking her head. "Talking? That's new. What did he think the dog said?" James shrugged, still feeling a bit ridiculous. "He couldn't make it out, but he said it wasn't barking. It was like whispers." Sarah set down the laundry and turned to face him. "You think he actually heard something?" "I don't know," James admitted. "But Pongo's strange. The way he moves, the way he looks at you. I know it sounds crazy, but he doesn't seem like a normal dog." Sarah studied his face for a moment, then sighed. "I think you're both just on edge. New house, new neighborhood, New dog next door. It's a lot of change. The kids are probably feeling it more than we realize. Maybe, James said, though he wasn't entirely convinced. The next day, Kayla texted Sarah, eager to set up the doggy playdate she had mentioned weeks earlier. Despite James's growing unease about Pongo, Sarah agreed. It was better to stay on good terms with the landlords after all. Maybe letting the dogs meet would ease everyone's nerves. That afternoon, Kayla brought Pongo over, her usual bubbly smile plastered across her face. "Here we are," she announced as Pongo padded into the yard. "He's been so excited to meet his new friend." James stood by the back door, watching with crossed arms as Charlie, their Jack Russell mix, approached Pongo cautiously. Charlie was normally friendly and energetic, but today something seemed to hold him back. His fur bristled, and he sniffed the air around Pongo without getting too close. Pongo stood still, his dark eyes following Charlie's every move. "Come on, Charlie," Sarah said, encouraging their dog. "It's okay. It's just Pongo." But Charlie didn't seem reassured. A low growl rumbled from his throat, something James had never heard before. The small dog's teeth bared as he snapped at Pongo, lunging forward. Kayla gasped, clearly startled. "Oh my goodness! Pongo's never been attacked like that!" James stepped forward quickly, calling Charlie back. "Charlie, hey! What's going on?" Pongo remained perfectly calm, his expression passive, almost pitiful, as he stepped back and gave a soft whine. Kayla knelt beside him, stroking his head. "Poor thing. I've never seen a dog react to him that way." James could feel the tension building. "Charlie's usually fine around other dogs. I don't know why he's acting like this." Pongo glanced at Charlie, his eyes narrowing slightly before looking back at Kayla, who stood up and brushed off her pants. "Maybe they're just not a good match," Kayla said, her voice a little less enthusiastic than usual. "We'll try again another time." James nodded, though a knot of dread formed in his stomach. "Yeah, maybe." As Kayla led Pongo back across the street, James felt a strange sense of relief, but also a nagging certainty that something wasn't right. He looked down at Charlie, who had retreated to the far corner of the yard, still watching the fence where Pongo had just disappeared. James stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the quiet settle around him. The tension in the air wasn't just between the dogs, it was something else, something lurking beneath the surface, just out of sight. As he glanced back across the street, Pongo was there, staring again, his dark eyes gleaming in the fading afternoon light. The feeling was back, stronger than before. It had been a few days since the failed doggy playdate, and the tension between the Walkers and their landlords had grown noticeably thicker. James couldn't shake the feeling that Pongo was always watching them, his dark eyes gleaming through the fence whenever they stepped outside. Even Charlie, their usually spirited Jack Russell mix, was on edge, growling low whenever Pongo was nearby. One night, after a long day at work, James sat in his office upstairs, catching up on some emails. The house was quiet, save for the faint sounds of Sarah cleaning up downstairs and the boys getting ready for bed. Outside, the familiar hum of distant highway traffic filled the air. It had become part of the background noise of their new life, but tonight it felt more oppressive than usual. Charlie had been let out into the fenced-in backyard to go to the bathroom, and James could hear his little paws scuffling in the grass. It was routine by now. Charlie would do his business, then sniff around for a while before coming back inside. As James rubbed his tired eyes, a sudden noise cut through the stillness. Charlie's frantic barking from the backyard. "Not again," James muttered, standing up and moving toward the window. He pulled back the curtain and peered into the yard, his heart immediately sinking. Charlie was standing near the back fence, his small body tense, barking wildly. His focus was locked on something just outside the fence. James squinted through the dim light and saw it. Pongo. The dog was pacing slowly along the perimeter of the Walkers' yard, his movements unnervingly graceful. Pongo stopped every few steps to stare at Charlie, his eyes gleaming in the faint moonlight. James grabbed his phone and quickly texted Nathan. James, hey, your dog is loose again. He's pacing outside our yard, and Charlie is going nuts. Nathan's reply came faster than James expected. Nathan, Pongo's inside. Must be another dog. James glanced down at the text, then back outside, his stomach twisting. There was no mistake. That was definitely Pongo, pacing along the edge of their yard like a predator stalking its prey. Before James could respond, the situation escalated. Pongo stopped pacing and stood still for a moment, his eyes locked onto Charlie. Then, in a flash of movement, he leaped over the fence into the Walkers' yard. James' heart skipped a beat as he watched in disbelief. Pongo landed with terrifying precision, his body low to the ground, and began moving toward Charlie. James slammed his hand against the window. Hey! But it was too late. In a blur of motion, Pongo lunged at Charlie, his massive jaws snapping down with a sickening crunch. Charlie yelped in pain, his small body twisting as he tried to escape the onslaught. The sight of it, the raw brutality of Pongo's attack, made James's blood run cold. He bolted from the room, racing down the stairs 2 at a time. Sarah! Pongo's in the yard! He's got Charlie! Sarah appeared in the hallway, her face pale with shock. What? How? I don't know, James yelled, throwing open the back door. Keep the boys inside! James ran into the yard, his heart pounding in his ears. By the time he reached the scene, Charlie had managed to slip away, limping toward the corner of the yard where he cowered behind a bush. Pongo stood over him, breathing heavily, his muzzle slick with blood. The large dog turned slowly to face James, his eyes dark and unreadable. James didn't hesitate. He grabbed a nearby shovel, brandishing it between himself and Pongo. Get away from him! For a long, terrifying moment, Pongo didn't move. He simply stood there, watching James with an intensity that felt disturbingly human. Then, as if deciding he had done enough for the night, Pongo turned and leapt back over the fence in one fluid motion, disappearing into the darkness. James dropped the shovel and rushed over to Charlie, who was whimpering in pain. The small dog's side was covered in scratches and puncture wounds, his fur matted with blood. James gently picked him up, cradling him in his arms. Sarah appeared at the back door, her face twisted with worry. Oh my God, is he okay? I don't know, James said, his voice shaking. I think he's hurt bad. We need to get him to the vet. Charlie survived the night, but barely. The vet had stitched him up, giving him pain medication and strict instructions for his recovery. The attack had left the little dog terrified, his once energetic personality replaced with a constant nervousness. He barely moved from his bed, and whenever he heard the faintest noise outside, he'd start growling low in his throat. The Walkers were shaken, but none more so than James. He couldn't get the image of Pongo's attack out of his mind, the deliberate, almost calculated way the dog had moved, the unsettling calm that had followed. The next morning, James called the police. An officer arrived later that day, and James recounted everything that had happened, trying to keep his voice steady as he described Pongo's violent behavior. Look, I know this sounds crazy, but that dog, it's not normal. I've seen him loose more than once, and I've heard him at night. He's dangerous. The officer, a tall man in his mid-40s with a tired expression, nodded as he took notes. You're saying the dog jumped the fence? Twice? Yeah, James replied. I saw him do it with my own eyes. He got into our yard and attacked Charlie. Did you confront the owners? The officer asked. James hesitated. Not yet. But I texted Nathan when it happened, and he insisted Pongo was inside. The officer sighed and looked toward Nathan and Kayla's house. I'll go talk to them. But without any solid proof, it's